He shouldn't have picked it up. I remember thinking that as soon as my gloves closed around the thing in the snow. Not because I believed in curses or because I expected a headline, because I knew how the world punished small, misplaced creatures. You pick one up, you warm it, you get it used to you, and then the whole racket of humanity takes notice. Still, I picked it up. It was January of 1974. The kind of blizzard that makes everything into a single color, white, then harder white, as if someone had poured milk over the world and forgotten to stop. The radio in my truck, one of those AM units military surplus types love, hummed like a loose wire. Every song sounded like it was being filtered through cotton, and the station I usually listened to was gone, replaced by a faint preacher and the hiss of the wind. I was working that week as a Forest Service technician, a job that leaves you alone with a lot of sky and the backs of trees. I was on my way back from checking a remote line when I saw movement in the ditch. At first, I thought it was a deer. Then I thought it was a bundle of branches. I'm a man who has seen something out of the corner of his eye and told himself it was nothing. But the thing in the snow was small and breathing, fast, shallow, like somebody had put a bellows inside a mitten. It wasn't right. The face, if you could call it that, was flat, with a little snout more than a nose, and eyes that were the wet color of river stones. It had hair, a reddish-brown fuzz that clung to its limbs in little clumps when it shivered. I could have left it. I could have pulled over to the shoulder and watched it disappear into the whiteness. That was the thought that kept knocking at my skull as I glanced at the road. Keep driving. You know better than to bring strangers home. But there are other things that knock louder than caution. The little thing's eyelids were already rimed with ice. Its breath fogged when I leaned down. I lifted it because it was the only thing to do. I have never pretended to be a hero. I was cold, tired, and thinking mostly about melted snow for the radiator and a warm bunk. I wrapped it in my coat and put it on the passenger seat. One of its little hands, if you can call what it had a hand, reached up and curled around my thumb with the kind of grip that would make you believe you were holding hope instead of a creature with claws the size of erasers. Back at the ranger cabin, I had a wood stove and a turntable. The stereo was a hand-me-down from town, the kind that still smelled faintly of smoke and the greasy hands of whoever had owned it before me. I remember putting on a record because you have to do something ordinary when everything else is strange. Carole King's voice filled the small room and seemed absurd next to the wind battering the walls. You've got a friend. I don't know what I expected. The track to sound wrong, my heart to harden, but it fit. The little thing listened. Its chest stopped trembling in a way I would later learn was its way of learning steadiness. I cleaned its wounds the only way I could. There were no vets who knew how to stitch whatever this creature was, and I didn't have sutures anyway. I used what a Forest Service tech always carries in his truck: a roll of gauze, some alcohol, a bit of whiskey for the numbness, and the kind of stubbornness that teaches you to improvise. I fashioned a splint from a length of spruce and some duct tape for a foreleg that must have been mangled on something hidden in the drifts. It cried when the crackle of the tape closed. The sound was something between a sob and a cough. Naming is a dangerous thing. Names make you accountable. They mean you cannot pretend later that you were just a passerby. But we named it anyway, Little Bit. It seemed honest, maybe a little cruel, but it fit the size of the thing and the smallness of what we were doing, trying to keep a life from finishing on the side of a road in the middle of a storm. The first days were a blur of tiny mercies. I fed it what I could: cornbread crumbs, lukewarm canned peaches, a little of my own stew. It surprised me by leaning its head against my knee like a dog, and when I put my hand out, it would place its oversized palm on mine, the pads calloused and the fingers too long, and close its eyes. There was an intelligence in that touch so ancient that it frightened me a little. The stove smelled of pine resin and old oil, and when Carole King's record came on for the second time, I pretended the world had been put back together in small human pieces. I slept badly because I kept reaching to make sure Little Bit was still breathing. I had a .22 by the bedside, born of a mountain upbringing, not paranoia, and I kept it within an arm's length. Not because I thought the creature would harm me, more because the world we lived in then and now would react badly to a thing nobody had a name for. A 22 is a poor thing to confront the anger of men, but it was there. When the storm cleared and the roads turned from white to slush to brown ribbon again, I did the only thing that felt right. I set Little Bit loose. I took it to the edge of the cedar and larch and let it go. For an hour before I opened the back of the truck, we sat with the wind coming through the windows and the world bright and sterile with snow. It watched me with that grave look adults use when measuring the mistakes of their youth. Then it reached up, touched my cheek, surprised me with the gentleness of it, and walked away into the trees. There are people who think, correctly in many cases, that if you bring a wild animal into your life, you condemn it to confusion. You make it human so it will want a human world, and then that world will take what you built away. I told myself that I did the right thing by letting it go. I told myself I had given it a chance to be what it was meant to be, something older and freer than me. I also told myself 1,000 small lies to sleep. I never told anyone about it, not my superiors, not the men at the maintenance yard who swapped stories over coffee. I filed it away under an entry no one else ever had access to, the kind of thing you keep because you need to believe you did at least once. Life does a kind of erosion on every secret. It smooths the edges with birthdays and paychecks and anniversaries. 2 weeks after the storm, I met Sarah. She was not the kind of woman you notice in a bar, if that bar has you at all, but she was the kind of woman you notice in a life. We met at the general store. She was paying for flour and coffee and a small jar of lemon marmalade. She laughed at a joke the cashier didn't make. She had a way of looking at the world like it could be trusted. We married in late spring. We built a small house on the edge of town, the way people do when they want to be close to the hills and not so close that the elk eat their garden. The house had a porch that moaned in wind and windows the color of old bones. We filled it with second-hand furniture, a stack of records, and later, 2 children. Emma came first, tiny, red-faced, easy to hold. Jake followed 2 years later, thick-limbed and loud. They are the reason men like me learn to think in longer spans than themselves. Where before I measured my days by weather and lines of phone wire, now I measured them by school starts and soccer practice and scraped knees at 3 in the morning. Little Bit lived in a different ledger, the one you keep folded up in the bottom drawer. If you asked me in those years whether the rescue had been an isolated act, I would have said yes. I would have said I left that kind of mercy to other, weirder men. But there are little things that don't fit into tidy boxes. Birds that used to sing in the pines around our place stopped coming and then came back in odd patterns. A bear would shy away from our garbage in a way that suggested someone else had put the fear there first. My kids never had that particular naked terror for the dark that children in the country sometimes have. They would tell stories about a shadow at the edge of the woods and laugh when Emma pretended to be scared. Little gifts of fruit left near the edge of the property, a pile of feathers not from any bird we knew. We accepted such things as part of a life near trees. I learned later, in fits and pieces, that the world around us is always watching back. Sometimes that's a sentimental sentence about how the wild knows its friends. Other times it's hunger or suspicion. For our part, we did what ordinary families do. We lived. We paid bills. We went to parent-teacher conferences. I climbed towers in summer and shoveled out pipes in winter. The logbooks at the office grew fat with entries about maintenance and fire lines, and I wrote 1974 like any other year. The secret of what I had done in that white storm sat like a stone in my pocket. It didn't rattle. It didn't announce itself. But it slowed me down sometimes, made me take an extra breath when I heard unfamiliar steps in the wood at night. It dried up part of the brashness that comes with being a young technician. There's a cruelty that comes with thinking you can fix everything with rope and elbow grease. Little Bit taught me caution. He taught me the shape of a promise. One night, when the kids were small enough that their breathing under the blanket sounded like separate bodies on the same river, Emma went missing for all of 5 minutes. We tore the house apart between breaths. I found her at the back door, barefoot, staring at a carved stone we had never owned. It sat on the step like an offering, smooth, shaped like a bear. She had her fat fingers curled around it. "It wanted me to have it," she said, matter of fact. I tucked the stone into my pocket, because what else do you do with impossible things left at your child's doorway? You hide them, you make them smaller. Years passed, jobs changed. I moved from one type of maintenance to another, and eventually the work meant I was more of a fixer of things and less of a hands-on ranger. Sarah found a job at the clinic in town. She became a person who could stitch a wound and read an X-ray, and more importantly, she became someone I had to tell the truth to if the marriage was to survive. I had held my mouth shut about the storm for a long time because some part of me believed that secrets were currency you could spend privately. But marriage is not an account you manage that way. It wants, hangs on, demands honesty like a plant wants water. I never told her about the baby in the snow in the way stories are usually told. I told her because of the carved stone, because of the way Emma hugged her pillow and named the trees in the yard as if they were old friends. One evening, long after we had both softened with wear, I sat her at the kitchen table and told her everything I had told myself before. The truck, the radio, the little breath in the ditch. I left out the shame I felt for naming it. I left out how often I woke up and listened for its inhale beside my own. She listened in that way that Sarah does when she is weighing, not judging. Her face was an honest map. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You saved it because you couldn't let it die in the storm." She didn't ask about the ethics of interfering with the wild. She didn't ask about paperwork or liability. She simply stated a fact that felt like a verdict and a benediction at once. "That's who you are," she said. "You see something that's hurting, you fix it. You always have." That was a moment of grace, and also a beginning of a problem, because now that she knew, she carried part of the secret with me. Secrets in a house with children are like embers left in a grate. They can warm you for a long while, but they also have the power to flare when the wind changes. For years, the secret stayed folded. Little tokens, a strand of fur on a clothesline that nobody admitted to leaving. The children, bless them, made up games about the woods people and insisted there was a friend watching out for their forts. I watched Sarah watch them, and sometimes she would look at me and I would think our secret had become a story we both believed. And then, as real life insists on doing, the years added bulk. Emma grew tall. Jake scored a goal and wore the scar like a medal. We paid a mortgage and replaced the roof. I turned 40. The old radio sat in a closet, and Carole King lived in a stack of records sometime between Fleetwood Mac and a Frank Sinatra collection that had been my mother's. We planted a maple tree in the yard when Jake was born, a symbolic thing people do to feel time has a shovel and a plan. In the quiet hours, I would sometimes go out to the edge of our land and stand, hands in my pockets, and listen. The woods talk to you if you have ears. There are creaks and sighs and small explosions of falling ice. Once, long after Little Bit had gone and before I told Sarah, I found tracks along the gravel road. 3 enormous prints that looked like someone had planted the bottoms of small boats into the earth. I stared at them until the wind erased them and told myself a story that would keep me warm. It had been a bear, a large man walking in boots. Anything but proof of what my thumb remembered. I grew used to that type of doubt. It's a human thing to fold mystery into a drawer labeled maybe. You protect your life the way you protect a garden from deer. Fences, small rituals, careful denial. Yet there were nights, I'll admit it, when the kid inside me hoped for more. You get used to being watched kindly. You get used to the idea that the world owes you a favor back for one small thing you did in a storm. You learn to live with the memory like an ember in your breast. Warm, dangerous if prodded, but also comforting in its smallness. I can picture, even now, the look that changed the ledger. It was November 1994. 20 years, give or take, enough that the memory had the patina of a coin you've kept in your pocket so long its edges wear. The maple I'd planted had become a tree with a crown in the wind. The kids were not kids the way they once were. Emma had a driver's permit, and Jake could think in sentences that were all sarcasm and charm. Work had me on a rotation that left me at home more often. The things that had once seemed like miracles had settled into the background noise of life. But memory has a way of leaning forward when the world gets quiet. It nudges. It opens a drawer. On a cold night in November, when there was a frost on the cars and the moon had that thin, hard look, like someone polishing a coin, I heard at the back door something that stopped my heart for the briefest, most honest breath. It wasn't the usual noises, the cat tripping a dish, a raccoon on the porch. It was a knock. Not a timid tap, but a deliberate, heavy knock that seemed to come from a hand the size of a small basket. I stood with my mug halfway to my lips and felt time narrow. The house made small sounds, the pipes talking to themselves, the old refrigerator's hum. But that knock was a punctuation mark on all of it. Then the dog, older now, less brave, barked once and was quiet. I told myself, for half a second, 100 plausible things. A neighbor, a late delivery, some drunk college kid. I told myself to go to the door and open it like any sensible man. I told myself it was nothing. Then I remembered the ditch, the heat of the coat, the small hand around my thumb. I remembered the way Carole King's voice had not been out of place in a world that suddenly contained a creature with eyes like river stones. I remembered that when you have once been given a secret, the world will sometimes test you with it, sometimes in the form of a knock. I moved toward the door slow enough to give myself excuses. I expected to find something ordinary through the window, a neighbor with a flashlight, a lost traveler. What I did not expect, and this is the exact place where memory stops being simple and becomes confession, was a shape so large it made the porch look like a toy platform. I will stop here for a moment because the truth of that image matters more than the moment itself. There are ways to describe a thing and ways to tell the truth. The thing on my porch, when I first saw it, could have been a tree stump. It could have been a misread stack of firewood. It could have been a fellow in a coat, a man in darkness. Instead, it stood there with the solemnity of a mountain. Hair, reddish-brown and thick. Shoulders that suggested the carrying of burdens older than my own. 2 eyes set in a face that, in the dim porch light, looked like the echo of the river stones from 20 years before. It had a mouth that, when it spoke, did not move like ours. The words came out in a low rumble, and yet I understood them. "Patrick," it said. The voice had a rust in it, like a shovel left out in the rain. "You took a baby from the storm." That was all. A sentence that should have been the end of a ghost story. But what it contained was not accusation so much as an accounting. You did this thing. Years later, the ledger came due. Or perhaps it was paying forward a compound interest I had not bargained for. I have told this moment a dozen ways to myself. Told it as if I had been brave. Told it as if I had been a fool. The truth is simpler and, in its bare way, worse. I stood at the door with my hand on the knob and felt my life rearrange, like a room when someone moves a chair without you looking. This is where I'm going to pause, not because I'm afraid to continue, but because some moments are heavy and deserve a slow turn. The porch was cold beneath my boots. The creature's breath fogged the air. The dog pressed its body against my leg, unsure which side of the house it belonged to. Inside the kitchen, Sarah was stirring something in a pan, the light amber in the window behind her. When you hear a knock like that, deliberate, patient, and filled with acknowledgement, the thing you learn quickly is that some deaths are not meant to be erased by silence. You can ignore them, you can rationalize them away, but they have a way of coming back to the door. If you enjoy these kinds of wilderness stories, the ones where people and places and small acts change the future, stick around. There's more to this one than a man and a knock. What came after that porch moment would test every promise I had ever made, and it would demand that my family learn the shape of a secret I had carried alone for too long. I opened the door anyway. The night presses into the kitchen like a cool hand. The creature is there, taller than any man I've known, but its eyes carry the same wet color as that baby in the ditch. It lifts a hand, the fingers calloused, the nails like small shields, and when it speaks again, the words come like the slow settling of an old tree. Little bit, I came back. Little bit, I came back. The words sank into the kitchen like heat into cold bread. For a second, I couldn't tell if it was the voice or the memory talking, if the sound was really on the porch, or if my head had folded the past and present into one thin sheet. Then the creature shifted its weight, and the porch boards groaned the way old wood does when it remembers rain. The dog tucked itself tighter against my leg, eyes wide and human in their worry. I started. My voice went thin, the way a line snaps when you put too much weight on it. You're... Little bit, it said again, more softly, and there was that same peculiar patience in the tone. Little bit, watch. Little bit, keep. Now, need. The English broke like an old fence. It reached toward me slowly, palms up, a gesture that felt like an offering and a plea at once. It had words enough to name me and to name that small, ridiculous thread that had tied us 20 years before. It did not have words for the things that matter in paperwork: liability, federal wildlife statutes, sensational headlines. It had words for need and for thanks. Those are both dangerous words in different ways. I remember doing something stupidly practical in that first astonished moment. I shut the oven off. Not because the oven mattered, but because the sound of the house clearing itself of minor noises made space for whatever was happening on the porch. Sarah paused with the spatula, looking over her shoulder at me, as if to read the shape of my face. I tried to make my face say something normal. It didn't. "Come in," I heard myself say, which was ridiculous and yet also the only real answer I had. The creature ducked into the house with the awkward grace of anyone not used to thresholds. It filled the kitchen in the way a winter storm fills a valley. There was no pretending against it. Up close, the eyes were exactly what I remembered. Clear, old as riverbed stones, wide and watchful. Its breath steamed in the kitchen light. It smelled of cold cedar and something older than our town, like the underside of river rocks. Little Bit, who was no longer little, who must have been close to 7 feet by then, by the way its shoulders crowded the doorway, spoke haltingly. "You help before. Little Bit come say thanks. Little Bit watch family. Many." The words ran thin at the edges, stitched together with gestures and sounds. It tapped a hand flat on its chest, fingers splayed. Watch. 1,000 practical things rose up in me, the obvious ones. Who would believe me? What would happen if someone saw? The more private ones cut deeper. The secret I'd carried alone for 2 decades had a weight to it now, not just because it existed, but because it had come asking for shelter. It asked for shelter. "I'm sorry?" I heard myself ask, even though I'd already heard it. Little Bit's large, calloused fingers curled in the air, as if trying to corral an idea. Elder, old, morning, baby, winter, too hard, need place for sleep, not stay long, winter only, then leave. He said the names like they were small things you set down and picked up again. Morning for the young mother, Reed, the baby, Elder Ash, a name like the bark of an old tree. He said winter only with the kind of urgency that made me think of frost on an unexpected night, sudden and dangerous. I don't know exactly what people imagine when they hear the story. Maybe the more sensational minds imagine violence, ransom, cameras. The truth, the quieter truth, was uglier in its simplicity. Here was an intelligent being asking a single favor for the sake of its people, And the only person in its life who had once bridged the human-wild divide was standing in his kitchen, wondering how many lives could be fit into the lean space of his conscience. "My family," I said. I wanted to say it like a fact. I wanted it to hang in the air with the flat authority of a dinner-time rule. I can't. Little Bit put a hand on the table. The knuckles were thick and creased, the way any hard worker's hands are. It looked at Sarah with slow, careful attention and said, "Safe, not harm. Keep quiet. Give food. Keep warm. Old will tell you story. Baby small, need milk." It was an awful list. It was also a list so human in its needs that you couldn't shake the marrow out of it. Milk, warmth, a place to sleep. Keep quiet. The thing on my porch, twice the size of me, spoke words any parent would know. It asked, plainly, to be trusted with the life of its own. I had two thoughts then. The reasonable one: how could we hide three enormous, practically mythical beings in a small town for an entire winter? And the ridiculous one: if I said no, what then? If I turned them away, did I sentence them to the ways of hunters in the cruel winter? The knowledge set heavy in my chest like a stone I refused to look at. Sarah stood a little taller as she listened. Her gaze moved from me to the creature with the careful evaluation of someone who'd stitched 100 things back together and knew how fragile a life could be if left to weather. Then, quietly, almost as if she were reciting a medical differential, she said, "If you're starving, we'll feed them. If they're hurt, we'll tend them. But Patrick, this can't be in the house." It was the right answer. It was the pragmatic, married person answer we both understood. It also put the problem into a shape I could possibly do something with: a shed. The shed back of our property was a half-built thing Dad had started before the second mortgage came due and then left like a hanging conversation. I had used it for lawnmowers and paint cans and a place to scare my children in Halloween. It was not the kind of place you'd keep something alive and secret for months, but it was a place. We talked, really talked, for the first time in a way that mattered. Not about bills or soccer practice, but about the ethics of harboring beings whose very existence would upend our lives. Little Bit watched, solemn and patient, sitting on its haunches by the back door like a foreign king at a small-town diner. It offered no manipulations, no promises, only an insistence that was both pleading and simple. "One winter," it said. "Help 3, then go." That was the whole of the request. A finite period, a clear time limit. It was the kind of constraint that made a man like me think it might be possible. I could imagine a winter's worth of hiding, a tight-lipped battle of wits with my better angels and with fear. I could not imagine what the world would do should anyone else see. That night, after Little Bit left, and Sarah and I had whispered possibilities and unreasonable plans, I lay awake and pictured my children. Emma, who had once brought home a carved stone she swore had been left by the woods folk. Jake, who still kept his baseball glove under his bed like a talisman. I thought of all the ordinary reasons one keeps secrets: love, shame, pride, terror, and how thin they look when stacked against the pulse of a living thing that asks for only shelter. I made a decision that night, perhaps the most consequential one of my life. Not because I had a plan to make a hero of myself, but because that small thing I had rescued in 1974 had at least twice in its life been handed over to the kindness of people. Once by me, and once, according to its telling, by the community of its own. Now it was asking a favor of my family. I could have said no. I didn't. We converted the shed. The work was simple in concept and impossible in detail. We insulated the walls with foam and old blankets, strung a battery-operated heater with multiple fail-safes, and cleared a space big enough for 3 sleeping forms. I tore down an old workbench and replaced it with pallets and straw bales. I secured the windows with extra latches and planted logs around the perimeter so that large, obvious foot traffic would be less likely, a clumsy and imperfect camouflage. The odor of cedar and oil and wet fur replaced the must of paint cans. It felt like building a secret room for an aging friend. Supplies were harder. We couldn't exactly shop for Bigfoot food on the town's ledger. So I improvised. Bulk sacks of rice and oats bought at different stores on different days. Extra tins of baby formula purchased in shifts and hidden in the back of the truck. Jars of peaches and corn from the summer's preserves. We learned what they would eat and what they wouldn't. Little Bit preferred soft things, stews, mashed potatoes. Morning liked warm bread and the kind of milk that smelled of grass. Reed, the baby, wanted warm, close things. He would wrap himself around a gloved palm and make a sound like a small bell. It took a week before morning arrived. I remember seeing her at the edge of the property before I'd seen anything else. A movement like a shadow among the cedars, and then the slow, deliberate reveal of a creature carrying a bundle. She was smaller than Little Bit by several hundred pounds and shorter in height, but there was a maternal ferocity in the way she guarded the bundle, an intensity that made my hands go cold with recognition of the same kind of love every parent knows. Reed peeped when she set the bundle down. He was startlingly human in the face, with a small, blunt nose and lashes the color of the winter straw. Elder Ash waded into the back of the trees. He had the stooped shoulders of someone who had carried a world on them for decades. When he came into the shed, using the path I'd cleared and the low light of a lamp I kept behind a paint tin, he moved like a man used to traveling long distances on his own terms. He lifted his chin and seemed to drink the room in, as if cataloging weather, warmth, and trust all at once. "Patrick Work," Little Bit said gently, as if introducing us. "Ash, remember you." Elder Ash's voice was lower than Little Bit's, and it seemed to come from lower in his chest. When he spoke, it was like a story beginning in a language you half remember. He offered his hand to me, and it felt like the bark of some old tree, rough and honest. We established rules that first night. They were not written down, they were understood with the tacit clarity of people making a pact. No venturing into town during daylight. No leaving tracks that led from our property to the highway. If someone came near the shed, we would move quickly and quietly. Least of all, we would not talk about them. That was the practical part. The moral part, how to make peace with the possibility of a life lived on a knife edge of secrecy, was heavier. Sarah's first night of hands-on help was not planned. She had suspected something. Those small anomalies, the occasional pile of fruit at the edge of the yard, had grown more frequent. When I finally told her in full, after the shed had been insulated and the pallets stacked, the first look on her face was something like fury. It wasn't anger at the creatures so much as at me for leaving her out of a thing that could imperil the family. "You could have put us in danger," she said, and those words carried with them all the facts that people use when the world feels unsettled. Illnesses, legal exposure, gawkers. What if someone found them? What if they were dangerous? "They're not dangerous," I said, which was true as far as my heart would allow. "They hurt sometimes. They've been hurt. My voice failed, in the way it sometimes did when I tried to explain a memory that had become a living presence. They only ask for a place to stay. She did not believe me right away. That was fair. But she had been the kind of woman who saw patients who had no one else, took in strays with injured paws, who had a patience with pain most people don't. When she finally went to the shed alone at night, it was because she had decided to see for herself instead of letting me carry the whole moral burden. What she found surprised even her. Elder Ash was a patient storyteller. He moved slowly, his hands making small loops in the air, and he spoke of things that were not so much history as memory. Rivers that had been larger, places where the trees had been broader and hung with different birds. He spoke of men with different hats who had cut down forests for pay, of traps that had not been as numerous once, of a slow shrinkage in the kinds of places to hide and to birth. "It is like someone took the world's blanket and pulled the corner until warm places were only in pockets," he said in his soft, rumbling cadence. "We move, we hide, we keep small, we sleep where earth is safe." He did not offer blame the way one expects of the embittered. He offered history, the kind that's a litany but also a funeral. He told of kin lost to snares and gunshots in seasons where the hunters came by mistake or hunger or lack of patience. He told of a sadness that was not malice, but the grief of a disappearing way of living. It was not a sermon, it was a catalogue of erosion. Sarah listened with the clinical focus of someone who has seen families break apart and knows the cost of things poorly handled. She did not soften immediately. She did not agree that we should flout laws. But she did take the baby Reed in her arms and hold him like an experienced nurse cradling a stranger's child, gentle, methodical, and very, very human. "You can't leave him out there," she said finally, looking up at me as if to deliver a verdict, and a verdict with teeth. "If he dies because of something we could have stopped, I can't live with that." There it was, in black and white. Not heroic, not noble on some high pedestal, just the ordinary truth of people who raise children. If you can stop harm and choose not to, you know the shame of your choice before you make it. Sarah's words shifted the whole plan in a way that made me both ashamed and grateful. It is a strange mercy to be saved from one's conscience by the steadiness of the person you promised to tell. So we carried on that winter. 2 humans and 3 of a species the town hadn't written into its maps, doing what we could to keep a small life afloat in a world inclined to notice the unusual. We developed rhythms. Mornings I would go to the shop at dawn and pick up coffee. Midday I would bring sealed containers of stew and loaves that morning seemed to favor. Evenings, after the children were in bed and the television fell into its predictable groove, Sarah and I would walk back to the shed with a flashlight and sit in the cold air just long enough to hear if anyone needed anything. Music came back into it, of course. One night, remembering how a record had soothed a small creature decades before, I put a Carole King record on a small battery-powered player and took it outside to the shed. The soft crackle of vinyl was ridiculous in such a clandestine operation, and yet the melody cut through the low conversations and the rustle of straw. Little Bit paused in the dim doorway and cocked his head. He hummed along in a low, vibrating sound. "Song," he said, almost disappointed when I stopped it. "Sound like house." Those small human things mattered. A lullaby hummed by Sarah as she rocked Reed. A pillow made from an old sweater I had worn on towers. A cache of old apple butter that morning discovered and loved. It was not a grand alliance. It was a string of human mercy stitched together by 2 adults who could not, in conscience, turn away. But, of course, nothing stays secret. Dale Morrison noticed first. Dale was the sort of neighbor who had a good eye and a restless curiosity. He worked odd jobs for the county and drove the gravel roads like he could read the earth. One afternoon in February, when the snow had thickened and the tracks in the back 40 were still mostly intact, Dale saw prints. Not the kind a bear leaves, not deer, not boot. These were deep hollows, the shape of an oversized foot, spaced like strides across the yard. He stopped the truck and walked closer, pressing his gloved hand against the snow and looking over his shed as if he expected it to confess. Dale didn't scream or call the sheriff right away. He went home and had a beer and told his wife that something odd was out by our place, something large and not human. He told a story in his own way, the same way he might tell how a truck had slid on a curve and been saved by a stranger. But you'd be funny not to notice. It didn't take long for his curiosity to become the sort of rumor that moves from porch to porch. I get that people like to imagine how it would go, how the cameras would swarm, how the county would become a circus. The reality is simpler and human. Rumors go to the sheriff's office, and the sheriff makes a plan. Sheriff Anderson was a steady man, not given to theatrics. He'd known me since I was a kid, fixing swings and helping my father in the harvest. He called me one evening with the kind of voice that says you can see the shape of something bad on the horizon and you want the certainty of a plan. "Patrick," he said, "you seen anything odd? Tracks? Someone else saw prints near your place." I could have lied. I won't pretend I didn't consider it. The impulse to protect the people you love by pressuring the truth into a neat box is reflexive. But lying creates its own costs. I told him the truth as well as I could without inviting a lynch mob. I said I'd seen tracks 2 weeks ago and thought they were from a large man walking with heavy boots. Sheriff Anderson's silence at the other end of the line was a thing I could have chopped wood with. "Keep your doors locked," he said finally. "If you see anything, call me first." We tightened our routines after that call. We started moving the creatures at odd hours. Little Bit and Morning learned to walk like shadows back to the deeper woods to avoid the gravel road where headlights might have seen them. Reed grew fat on milk and small warm things. Senior Ash told longer stories into the nights when the snow would fall like a curtain and the world would muffle, and we would sit and listen. One evening, though, Dale's curiosity turned into something more decisive. He was returning from a fishing trip. He'd always been fond of the Bitterroot stretch north of town, and he came by our place because he said he wanted to check on some old fencing. He drove past the shed and saw a shape at the doorway. It was dusk. The light had turned the sky a steely purple. He slowed his truck, peered out, and then slammed the brakes. When he saw Morning and Reed, it was like watching someone realize a joke was no longer funny. He climbed out of his truck and stomped toward the shed, shouting a question. I remember hearing the shout and feeling my stomach drop like a stone. I told myself he would walk away. I told myself the darkness would swallow him. It did not. "Patrick," he shouted, voice cracking, "you got something out here. What the hell is that?" Dale was the kind of man who used the wrong words quickly and then had no idea how to take them back. He saw Reed first, small, wobbly on Morning's arm, and his mind made a leap it couldn't unmake. He saw a baby being held by a creature and could not decode it in any way other than alarm. I grabbed him before he could get to the shed, because what else do you do? I put my hands on his arms and tried to keep a voice that sounded authoritative. "Dale, you need to come with me. Not here, not now." He shoved my hands off, eyes wide and furious. "What are you hiding, Patrick? What in God's name?" He didn't finish. He turned and ran to the shed anyway. Morning stepped forward without a sound. She blocked his path with a small, motherly intensity that made his feet stop. Reed, warm in her arms, bleated a small, frightened sound. Dawn's light fell on her face and showed the plain truth: a mother protecting her child. Dale's response was to grab his cell and dial the sheriff's office. It was the moment I had feared. He called Sheriff Anderson and told him there was something out here that looked unnatural. The words hit the line like a match on kindling. Within the hour, lights from police cruisers trimmed the horizon. We had not planned for an immediate confrontation. We'd thought maybe a tip would lead to a slow, creeping badness, the kind where the county sends a man out to look and leaves. We did not think Sheriff Anderson would come with deputies on a crisp, Minnesota-style winter night, where bright beams of light scanned the hedgerows like insect eyes. He came anyway. He and Deputy Rogan walked up to the house and saw an ordinary life: a porch with footprints in the snow, 2 kids inside poring over a comic book, me standing on the steps like a man with his jaw set. He asked questions. He was level and calm and probing. He had a lawman's patience. I tried to be as honest as possible without telling him about the things hidden behind the insulated walls. "Mr. Carter," he said, in a way that had both kindness and protocol, "if there's something out there that could be dangerous, you need to tell us." "There's nothing dangerous," I said, which at the time I believed. The truth is, danger comes in 1,000 shapes, and not all of them involve teeth. It can be exposure, it can be a frightened neighbor with a weapon, it can be an agent with a camera and a microphone. I told him I'd heard about Prince. I told him Dale had been here. I said we had nothing to hide, and then remembered the shed and lied, in all the ways men do when they put their mouths in service of protection. Sheriff Anderson's eyes softened, but his job did not. He left with a warning and a promise to circulate the description. He instructed Dale to keep away and asked me to call if anything happened. As soon as the sheriff's cruiser turned away and the blue light blinked into the night, we moved into action. There are plans you don't practice until you have to. We had one, in a way, an evacuation route that ran along old game trails through a stretch of BLM land that led north. We dug out an old sled, packed what we could carry in darkness, and prepared to move 3 living beings into the deeper, ancient patches of forest where the road ended and the world remembered how to be quiet. Packing was hurried, messy, and tender. Morning wrapped Reed in a hide warmed by the stove and a sweater Sarah had knit years before. Elder Ash folded himself with the awkward dignity of someone whose shoulders had borne storms before. Little Bit carried a bundle of the food we'd brought and held my hand for a breath as if to say, "Thank you." His fingers closed around my thumb like the first time, and I felt the old, ridiculous surge of hope and terror that had changed my life long ago. Sarah's role that night mattered more than I can say. She had been furious at me the week before, rightly so, but she galvanized into a decisiveness that surprised me. She moved through the house with the efficiency of someone used to sewing wounds shut. She packed a small bag with antibiotics and gauze, sensible things, and a small Indian rug that would cover Reed. She looked at me for a moment and said, "We do this right. No panicking, no leaving tracks here that ruin the route." She walked the line of the evacuation map with me and then turned to the kids in the living room. "Go to the neighbor's house," she told them. "Tell them you're staying the night. Don't tell anyone else anything." Emma and Jake, bless them, packed their cheeks with fear like kids do, and obeyed. There is a kind of economicized courage in children. They accept the oddities of their world without the same moral calculus adults drag through. We left before dawn. The sky was a black cloth stitched with a few thin stars. The woods swallowed us. The ground had frozen and the sled scraped along the top of the snow. Elder Ash moved with a deliberate tread that suggested a knowledge of soft places. Morning kept close to Reed, murmuring in low tones that soothed him into a sleep like a child's lullaby. Little Bit stayed at the edge of our family, his presence both sentinel and an old companion. We walked for a long time, and the town receded, and with it the risk of sirens and shiny lights. Our feet fell into rhythms. We used animal paths that bypassed the gravel road, crossed a little stream where the ice had refrozen in frightening slick veins, and climbed a ridge that hid us from the glance of any road. For all the fear, it was the kind of night that felt not like a fleeing but a righting. We were moving something to where it belonged. We saw the lights a week later, small, distant, a blush of humanity in the dark, and we did not stop for them. We had chosen a direction and a reason, and felt the kind of moral clarity that rarely visits men entangled in their small-town lives. We walked north, where the land folded up into something less known and more remembered. We gave directions with hand gestures and old logging roads. The creatures learned the cadence of our walking and answered it with their own deep, patient steps. After a month, wordless and slow, I came back. The world had not collapsed into visible catastrophe while we were away. Emma had been staying with a friend 2 towns over. Jake had been tucked in a similar arrangement. Sheriff Anderson did come by a few times to ask if we'd seen anything new. He had a kind of humble respect for the unknown, but he also had to keep order. He would never, I think, be the sort to pester a man who had taken a risk for decency. There are duties the law does not own. The carved token appeared on my windowsill about 3 weeks after I'd returned. I found it the way you find a note you didn't know you needed. Early in the morning, the light not yet strong enough to burn away sleep, a small, smooth object on the ledge. It was the size of a child's fist, a small bear carved with an obvious hand. The grain of the wood was old and damp-smelling. There were pictographs burned into its belly, the only sign of a language that had the grammar of images. I sat with the token for a long time, not because it solved anything, but because it confirmed the thing I'd believed all along, that kindness has a way of compounding and paying back in small miracles. They had not been found. They had made it away. They had left a thank you in an idiom older than speech, a carved offering. I felt all sorts of things then. Relief, wonder, a dull ache of loss that is the shape of every small good thing you must let go of to keep safe. It felt like an accounting balanced in human terms. We had given them shelter, they had, in some way, offered gratitude back. That had to be enough. The months and years that followed did what months and years always do. They filled in with ordinary life. Emma left for college. Jake glued himself to some trade school and the steady rhythm of building things with his hands. Sarah and I got older. Our hair gained streaks of silver. The maple tree grew taller and got its first scar. Folks still told stories about prints up in the county, weird lights, someone seeing a shadow on the ridge. The talk never went past the town benches. People like that tend to keep their own counsel. I keep the carved token now in a drawer. Sometimes I take it out and rub the worn edges with my thumb, feeling the tiny grooves. It is not a trophy. It is a thing that remembers. I think of Elder Ash in mourning and read, and the way Little Bit watched over us all those years. He told me once in the language of simple verbs and gestures that he had been watching since I set him down in the snow, because someone else had once taken him in. He said the arrangement had been a community thing, small kindnesses given and owed, like the practice of leaving a pot on a neighbor's doorstep when times were lean. He said his people had their own rules about hiding and surviving. They had been dwindling, he told me, but not in the way a man counts numbers. They were shuddering in the small, quiet ways that leave a species without a voice. Fewer songs around the fire, fewer small things left at the edge of a path. There is a moral in this, if people want to call it that. I have my own. Kindness asks for risk. When you reach for a small, shivering thing at the edge of a storm, you do not know how broad the consequences will be. You might endanger your home, your reputation, your quiet life. You might be asked to hold more than you ever thought you would. You also might be given something in return that no bank can measure. A gratitude so old it comes without words. A quiet proof that the world remembers small debts. I still go out on nights when the snow is thick and the radio hums like a wire. Sometimes I stop the truck on the shoulder and look into the trees. On rare occasions, I feel a presence at the edge of the road that isn't there, or I find a small offering, a feather, a leftover apple, a scrap of cloth, on the step. I don't tell the sheriff. I don't post photos. I keep it like the carved bear in the drawer, a private ledger of mercy. People ask, sometimes, what I would do again. If the knock came now and Little Bit stood on my porch asking for help, the answer is simple and terrible and comfortable. I'd do the same. I'd risk the small safe things for a life. It's a choice that makes you more complicated in the best ways. It makes you accountable to something larger than your own comforts. He shouldn't have taken that baby from the blizzard, some might say. They'd mean it as a rebuke, an argument in favor of letting nature run its course. I don't see it that way. He did take it. Hands warmed by a wood stove, music creasing the room with human voices. And the result was a whole chain of lives altered, saved, complicated. 20 years later, a knock on my door asked nothing in return but shelter for a winter. I think sometimes that the world keeps score, and sometimes it forgives. We managed to keep a small, stubborn kindness between us and the trees. If you were in my place, would you have let them in? Would you have built a shed and stock it with food? Would you have lied to a sheriff? Would you have asked your family to make the same leap? I can only speak for myself. In the end, the ledger looked like this: a life given shelter, a family stretched and then steady, a carving left on a windowsill like a benediction. If this story moved you or made you think about the kind of small risks kindness demands, take a moment to like and share it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if a knock like that came on your porch?